and today we're going to be working on some ornate frames using cracked gesso and Toscana milk paint for an old world finish. Give these a wipe down with clean slate just to make sure we have a clean surface to work with. For my first layer, I'm going to use One Step paint in light base. I'm choosing this color because I want a white for my first layer. I do want to be able to see some little hints of that white after all of our layers of Toscana milk paint. I'm using a synthetic brush to apply my One Step paint. You can use a chip brush or whatever works best for you. I am going to want to do 2, 3, maybe even 4 layers just to make sure this is a solid white base. I really want to make sure I've got a solid color on here before I go in with my cracked gesso and my milk paint. Once our One Step paint is dry, we're ready to move on to cracked gesso. Cracked gesso is a really great way to get a textured, cracking look with your Toscana milk paint. While I'm letting my last coat of One Step paint dry, we're going to mix up our cracked gesso. This is a powdery substance, just like Toscana milk paint, and we're going to mix it the same way you would mix milk paint. 1 part powder and 1 part water. So you're going to need a bowl to mix in, an artist brush, a chip brush, something to stir with, and some warm water. Not hot water, but warm water. So we're going to take 1 part cracked gesso, and it is just a powder, and 1 part warm water, and we're going to mix this up. It can be a little tough to mix. Takes a little bit longer than milk paint to mix all the way through, but you want to make sure that it is mixed thoroughly. Now this is going to be a really watery substance once it's mixed together, and that is totally normal. It's kind of strange to put on because it kind of seems like you're painting with water. You kind of are, but don't mix extra cracked gesso into your substance. It does want to be a little watery. Now I usually like to let this set up for a little bit. Not very long, but I'll mix this while my last coat of One Step is drying, and I'll just let it sit for maybe 20 minutes and then it's ready to use. Cracked gesso and cracked patina are a little bit different. Cracked patina is used with One Step paint, and cracked gesso is designed to work with your Toscana milk paint. Our layers of One Step are totally dry, so we're going to start applying our cracked gesso. I'm just using an artist brush. You can totally use a chip brush or whatever works for you. These are a little bit smaller than like a dresser, so I'm using a small brush for that. And this is watery. It's gonna go on watery, and that is totally just how this stuff is. So we're just gonna apply this over the entire thing, and I am gonna go back and do 2 layers of this. You can experiment with that and see, you know, how much of a crack you want. This stuff is really fun to play with. But I know that I usually like 2 layers of this. So I really want to make sure these ornate parts are covered because that's where I want the most of my crack. So we're going to just make sure those are really covered and then smooth it out so it isn't dripping. And now we're going to wait for that to totally dry, and then I'm going to come back and do this entire process one more time just to give it 1 extra coat. A couple coats of our cracked gesso, we're ready to start in with our first color of Toscana milk paint. Toscana milk paint is a really great way to create an old world, true European antique look without having to wait the hundreds of years that it took to get there. When we're done with cracked gesso, we're ready to mix up our first color of milk paint. I'm gonna be using a mixture, which is one of my favorite things about milk paint, is that you can mix your own colors from the colors already provided. So one of my favorite mixtures is Venetian green with a tiny bit of topiary just to give it a little extra hint of green. So we're gonna mix these with warm water, and you're gonna need a couple different Tupperwares, a measuring spoon, warm water, a chip brush or something to stir with, and a strainer. So milk paint is a 1-to-1 mixture, so we're gonna take 1 part milk paint and 1 part water, and I just mix these into old Tupperwares. Anything you have lying around will totally work. So I'm gonna use my little measuring spoon, and I'm gonna start with Venetian green. I really love this color, it's just so beautiful. We're gonna do a scoop of Venetian green. Put it into our Tupperware. And then for my favorite mixture, I'm just gonna use a tiny hint of this topiary. I kind of wish that Venetian green was just a tiny bit greener, so I just add a tiny hint of topiary and it creates the perfect color for me. I totally advise that you experiment with milk paints and mixing colors. It's kind of just the fun part about this. So I'm just gonna add a little of that topiary. And then I'm gonna add 1 part warm water. So same thing, we're gonna measure out our warm water. And since I only added a tiny bit of that topiary, I'm just gonna add a tiny extra warm water. And this is gonna be a watery substance. That's totally just how milk paint is. It's not supposed to be thick. It's supposed to be watery. So it does take a little bit of getting used to. It's not like your regular chalk paint or anything like that. And we're just gonna thoroughly give this a mix. And then I advise you strain this. It really helps to get those bigger chunks out, and I think it really kind of adds to your finish, makes it go on smoother. And I'm just using the end of a chip brush to mix this. Totally use anything. And then we're gonna take our strainer. This is just a regular paint strainer from Harbor Freight. You can use cheesecloth as well. And we're just gonna put this through so that all of those big chunks are out. Now notice I'm only mixing a tiny bit of this. I'm working on really small frames, so I don't want to have too much milk paint. I try and just mix as much as I need for the project that I'm working on. So that is strained. And now we're ready to apply. Once our gesso is dry, I'm gonna come back and hit this with just some really light 320 sandpaper, not to take away any of the paint or the gesso, just to get a couple of those really high bubbles or ridges away from this. And I don't seem to have too many this go around, so just a really light sand. And then as always, when you're done sanding, make sure that you wipe away all of that dust. I'm just using a dry brush. Okay, so these are ready for milk paint. And we have our mixture here of Venetian green and topiary. Now I'm gonna do this with a sea sponge today. A lot of the times you'll see milk paint applied with a brush, which is awesome and totally great for that certain type of texture and finish. For these, I'm gonna use a sea sponge. So I've got a couple different ones here. I like to have a couple different ones because each one is gonna leave you a little bit different texture. And we're gonna dip this into our milk paint and start applying it. Now with the sea sponge, I make sure that I wet these down first because when they come out of the package, they are really hard. So you wanna get them wet and bring them back to their natural state. And then I dip this in the milk paint and just wring out the excess. And we are gonna just go and start applying this like this. I really like the way that a sea sponge gives this kind of a distinct texture and look. It's really fun to experiment with milk paint and different ways to apply it. I don't want these to have like a brush stroke finish. I want them to look really aged and textury and cracked. So I'm going with a sea sponge for these. And I'm just gonna cover this entire thing because we're gonna do a couple different layers. And this is just what I want on my base. I love the way that Toscana milk paint can build different layers and depth on your piece. It really gives you that old world look that you don't get with other types of paint. I found that Toscana milk paint is one of my most used products in my shop, and there's so many different ways to use it. Milk paint is really watery to work with. That's totally just how it's supposed to be. It's great to be able to do this on a horizontal surface. I just got this everywhere, because it does get messy. Since it's so watery, it can drip when you're doing it on a vertical surface. So it's nice to be able to work flat. I will show you some other time how I go about applying milk paint on a not flat surface, because most furniture isn't all flat. I'm just gonna make sure I get all these edges. And with milk paint, the product is gonna settle on the bottom, and that's just something to be aware of. This is an all natural product. There's no preservatives or strange additives like some paints that keep it all mixed together at all times. So because this is a natural product, you are gonna have pigment settle on the bottom and your water separate. So even after it's strained, if you leave it too long, you are gonna wanna be able to kind of agitate it and stir it again. That really just makes sure that all of that pigment is back in, so you're getting the most out of your color. Okay, and I'm gonna call that good for my first layer, and we're gonna let this completely dry. Your temperature is gonna determine how long this needs to dry. Usually about 20 minutes is pretty good. You can hit it with a hair dryer if you want it or need it to dry quicker for whatever you're working on. So we're gonna let this fully dry, and then we'll come back with our Venetian brown. For our second color of milk paint, I'm going to be using Venetian brown. Doing the Venetian brown with the Venetian green and Topiary mixture is one of my most used combinations, so we're going to go ahead with that. Same mixture as we did before, 1 part powder and 1 part water. All Toscana milk paint colors are sourced from Italy and the south of France. They're sourced from natural quarries, unlike other milk paints that are synthetic colors. When our Venetian green milk paint is dry, we're gonna go in with Venetian brown, and this is what it should look like once you're done with your first color. I really love the way that the sea sponge gives this texture that's not the same as a paintbrush stroke. So we're gonna go in with our second color the exact same way that we did our first one. We've got our wet down sea sponge and our mixed Venetian brown. So we're gonna dunk this in, squeeze out the excess, and just apply this all over. Something worth noting about milk paint is that the color that it mixes when it's wet is going to be a lot darker than the color that it will actually turn out to be. So when you're mixing your milk paint and you think, hey, this doesn't look quite like it does in the package, just remember that it's going to mix quite a bit darker, but it will dry to the color that you see in the package. And we're gonna let both of these dry completely, another 20 minutes or so, and then I'm gonna go back and layer on 1 more coat of that green mixture of the Venetian green and Topiary. Once we're done with all of our layers of milk paint, we're ready to use Antique Glaze. This product works hand in hand with Toscana milk paint and really gives it that aged finish. Antique Glaze is super simple to use. There's no mixing involved. It's already ready in the container that it comes in. So you just take your container of Antique Glaze, pour it into your bowl or Tupperware of choice, something that's big enough to fit a sea sponge in, because that's what we're going to use to apply it. So we've got our Tupperware or bowl full of Antique Glaze, And we're gonna take a dry sea sponge, dried but wet down, just a clean one, not the same one that you used for your milk paint if it's still dirty. And we're gonna push this in here and soak up a ton of it and then wring it out so it's completely saturated and ready to use. Now, Antique Glaze removes some of your layers of milk paint. It also really creates this beautiful amber tint. So you'll kind of learn how you like to use this. I like to just apply it everywhere. Now this stuff is pretty forgiving. If you find that you've removed too much of your milk paint, you can go ahead and go back over it with more milk paint and repeat this process. Now this is where you're gonna find that Antique Glaze removes a little bit of your layers. Now that's why I wanted that white base on the underneath, because I did want that to show through just a little bit. I think that that white underlayer really looks great with these greens and browns and kind of mixes all together really well. Just like milk paint with Antique Glaze, you can do as many or as little layers as you want. Just kind of play around with it and see what you like. I usually just do it one time, but I'll kind of sit and wait for it to dry a little bit and kind of see what it looks like, and then add a little bit more if I feel like it needs it. Milk paint are completely dry, we're gonna go in with a couple different things just to wrap all these up. I'm gonna use some clear wax, some dark antique wax, and I'm gonna show you how I use just a little bit of gold leaf for that special touch. These steps are totally optional. You can totally choose to leave these as is. They are absolutely beautiful with all of these layers and cracks as they are. I'm just gonna use a couple little things to tie everything all together so it blends super well. I am going to use some gold leaf. Gold leaf sheets from Amy Howard Home are really easy to use, and I highly recommend using her product Gilding size. It's kind of like a glue, but it's like an adhesive for your gold leaf, so it goes exactly where you want it to go. If you have any comments or questions about this finish, leave them below. Look forward to seeing you guys next week.